Sometimes you finally say no to something you didn't want to do. You explain politely. You try to be kind. You don't raise your voice. You just say no. And a few minutes later, something feels wrong. You replay the conversation in your head. You wonder if you sounded cold. You imagine the other person feeling hurt. You start thinking you should have handled it differently. And suddenly, instead of feeling proud for protecting your time, you feel like the bad person. The strange part is, no one told you you did anything wrong. This video isn't about being rude or selfish. It's about why setting boundaries can make you feel guilty. What if the guilt isn't about the boundary, but about what your brain learned long ago? Right after you say no, the silence feels louder than the conversation itself. Nothing dramatic happens. No one yells. No one insults you. There's no obvious conflict. And yet, your body reacts as if something terrible just happened. You might notice it in small ways first. A tightness in your chest. A heaviness in your stomach. A sudden urge to check your phone. A restless need to replay the conversation again and again, searching for a mistake you might have made. You start remembering the exact tone of your voice. The way their face looked. The pause after you spoke. You wonder if the pause meant disappointment. You wonder if the silence meant hurt. You wonder if the conversation is still echoing in their mind the way it is in yours. It's strange how quickly the moment shifts. Just minutes ago, you were focused on your needs. Now your attention has completely moved outward. Toward their feelings. Their reaction. Their interpretation. Your mind begins creating possible scenarios. Maybe they think you don't care. Maybe they feel rejected. Maybe they believe you're changing. Maybe they're upset right now. And the most uncomfortable thought slowly appears. Maybe you hurt them. This is usually the moment when the guilt begins to grow. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, like a slow emotional pressure that becomes harder to ignore with each passing minute. You might feel the urge to soften what you said. To send a follow-up message. To add extra kindness. To explain again. To make sure everything is okay. Not because anything bad actually happened. But because something inside you feels unsettled by the possibility that it could have. It's important to notice how quickly the focus shifts from your boundary to their comfort. The original reason you said no starts fading into the background. The emotional spotlight moves to the other person's experience. Your needs become quieter. Their imagined feelings become louder. You start asking yourself questions that weren't there before. Was I too direct? Could I have said it more gently? Should I have explained more? Was my tone wrong? Did I sound annoyed? The conversation is already over, but internally it keeps happening again and again, each replay adding a new layer of doubt. This emotional rewind can last minutes, hours, sometimes even days. And during that time, the original boundary begins to feel less solid. You might begin to question whether it was necessary at all. Maybe I could have just done it. Maybe it wasn't such a big deal. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I made things awkward for no reason. This is the moment where the guilt starts quietly rewriting the story. The boundary slowly transforms from something protective into something suspicious. Instead of feeling like self-respect, it begins to feel like potential harm. And the longer this inner dialogue continues, the more your emotional certainty fades. You may notice yourself becoming more attentive to the other person's behavior afterward. If they reply a little slower than usual, it feels meaningful. If they seem slightly distant, it feels connected. If their tone changes even subtly, your mind links it back to the moment you said no. You start scanning for evidence that your boundary caused damage. Every neutral reaction begins to feel like confirmation. This emotional monitoring can feel exhausting. It turns a simple interaction into a lingering emotional event that stays with you long after it ends. And because the guilt is uncomfortable, your mind begins searching for ways to relieve it. One of the most common ways is to compensate. You might become extra helpful later. Extra available. Extra accommodating. Extra kind. almost as if you're trying to rebalance something invisible. Sometimes you may even overextend yourself in the days that follow, saying yes to things you would normally hesitate about, simply to restore the sense that everything is okay again. It becomes a quiet emotional repair mission. But the most confusing part is this. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. The other person may not even be upset. They may have accepted your boundary without difficulty. They may have moved on immediately. Yet internally, the moment still feels unresolved. This gap between external reality and internal experience can feel deeply confusing. You know you didn't do anything terrible. You know saying no is normal. You know boundaries are healthy. And yet, your emotional system reacts as if something dangerous just happened. As if you broke an unspoken rule. As if you stepped outside a role you were supposed to maintain. That feeling can be hard to explain, even to yourself. It doesn't feel logical. It doesn't feel rational. It simply feels real. And because it feels real, you start trying to fix it in the only way you know how, by questioning yourself. You may tell yourself you just need to stop overthinking. You may remind yourself that everyone sets boundaries. You may repeat the idea that saying no is healthy. But the emotional discomfort doesn't disappear just because you understand it intellectually. Instead, it lingers quietly in the background. This is where many people start believing something is wrong with them. They assume they're too sensitive, too anxious, too conflict avoidant, or simply not strong enough. But what if this reaction isn't a flaw? What if it's a learned emotional response? What if the guilt that appears after setting boundaries didn't start in adulthood? What if it began much earlier, long before you ever had the words, boundaries, or self-care? Because if the present moment feels so emotionally loaded, it might be connected to experiences that happened long before this conversation ever took place. And if that's true, then this uncomfortable feeling might not be about the boundary itself at all. It might be about the emotional history that boundary quietly touched. When the guilt lingers after a boundary, the mind tries to make sense of it by telling stories. Not dramatic stories. Small ones. Everyday ones. Quiet interpretations that seem harmless but slowly reshape the meaning of what happened. You might tell yourself that the other person is probably disappointed. That they expected more from you. That they needed you. That they counted on you. You imagine their perspective with surprising detail. You picture their facial expressions, their tone, their thoughts. Sometimes you even imagine conversations they might be having about you. She's changed. He's becoming distant. They don't care like they used to. None of this is happening in reality. But inside your mind, the emotional simulation feels real enough to trigger genuine discomfort. This is how emotional responsibility begins to expand beyond what actually occurred. The boundary itself was simple. One sentence. One moment. One decision. But the emotional meaning attached to it becomes larger and larger the longer you think about it. You begin to feel responsible not only for what you said, but for how it might have been received. For how it might have been interpreted. For how it might affect the other person's feelings later that day, or later that week. Your role quietly shifts from participant in a conversation to guardian of someone else's emotional experience. And once that shift happens, the guilt has somewhere to grow. Because if you believe you are responsible for other people's feelings, then any boundary can start to feel like harm. This belief doesn't appear suddenly. It sneaks in through small everyday experiences. You notice it in how quickly you monitor tone. How quickly you soften language. How quickly you add explanations. How quickly you try to reassure. You might notice that when you say no, you instinctively follow it with extra kindness. Extra gratitude. Extra apologies. Extra context. I wish I could, I'm so sorry. I hate to say no, I really do. I feel bad, I just can't right now. I hope that's okay. These additions often feel automatic. You don't plan them. They appear before you even have time to think. And if you pay attention, you might notice something interesting. The apology often feels more necessary than the boundary itself. That no feels risky. The apology feels safe. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar. Boundaries are wrapped in reassurance. Limits are softened with emotional cushioning. Decisions are packaged with guilt. It becomes a social reflex. And because it happens so frequently, it begins to feel normal. You may not even realize how much energy is being spent trying to prevent discomfort in others. You might notice it in the way you say yes before checking your schedule. Or agree before checking your energy. Or volunteer before checking your capacity. The habit of preemptive accommodation can feel like kindness, cooperation, or being easygoing. But sometimes it is something else, an attempt to avoid the emotional aftermath of saying no. Because you already know what happens after. The guilt. The overthinking. The emotional replay. The quiet feeling that you've done something wrong. And so the mind tries to avoid that future discomfort by preventing the boundary in the first place. This is why boundaries often feel heavy before they even happen. You are not just deciding whether to say no. You are anticipating the emotional cost of saying no. The cost feels invisible but very real. It feels like tension. Like responsibility. Like emotional risk. Sometimes you might even notice physical hesitation before responding to a request. A pause. A tightness. A split second where your mind scans for the safest answer. Yes feels easy. No feels loaded. Even when yes creates stress later, it feels lighter in the moment. Because yes protects the emotional atmosphere. No changes it. An emotional atmosphere can feel incredibly important when you are used to keeping it stable. You might begin to notice how quickly your mood reacts to other people's reactions. A small shift in tone can feel meaningful. A delayed reply can feel significant. A short message can feel loaded. This emotional sensitivity often makes relationships feel intense and deeply connected. It can create strong empathy and awareness. But it can also create an invisible pressure, the pressure to maintain harmony. Harmony becomes something you quietly manage. You monitor conversations, moods, and subtle signals to keep interactions smooth. And when harmony feels threatened, your nervous system reacts. Not dramatically. Quietly. Internally. A small spike of anxiety. A wave of discomfort. A sudden urge to repair. That urge to repair can show up in many ways. You might send a follow-up message clarifying your tone. You might add humor to lighten the moment. You might check in later to make sure everything is okay. These behaviors often look like care. And in many ways, they are. But they are also attempts to restore emotional equilibrium. The emotional system begins to associate boundaries with disruption. Not conflict. Not rejection. Disruption. A shift in tone. A pause in conversation. A change in dynamic. And disruption can feel deeply uncomfortable when your nervous system is used to stability and predictability. So the guilt that appears after setting a boundary isn't just about the words you used. It's about the ripple effect your mind imagines afterward. The imagined shift in the relationship. The imagined disappointment. The imagined distance. Your mind tries to prevent that imagined distance by pulling you back toward reassurance. You might notice this especially in close relationships. With friends, partners, family, or co-workers you care about. The closer the relationship, the heavier the guilt can feel. Because the emotional stakes feel higher. The relationship matters. The connection matters. The sense of closeness matters. And anything that feels like it could threaten that closeness feels significant. Even a simple no. Over time, this pattern can create a quiet emotional paradox. You want to protect your energy. You want to honor your limits. You want to take care of yourself. But you also want people to feel comfortable, valued, and safe with you. And sometimes those two goals feel like they are in tension with each other. Setting a boundary can feel like choosing yourself over someone else. Even when that's not what's actually happening. The emotional brain doesn't always distinguish between self-care and self-prioritization. It simply notices the shift in focus. For a moment, the attention moves inward instead of outward. And that shift can feel unfamiliar if your attention has been trained to move outward first. So the guilt that appears afterward can feel like a signal. A warning. A message that something about the interaction needs repair. But what if the signal isn't about the present moment at all? What if it is connected to an older emotional rule? A rule that formed long before adult conversations, work schedules, and social expectations. A rule about what it means to be good. A rule about what it means to be kind. A rule about what it means to be loved. Because when guilt appears this quickly and this consistently, it often points to something deeper than the situation itself. And once you begin to consider that possibility, a new question starts to emerge quietly in the background. Where did this emotional rule begin? When that question appears, where did this emotional rule begin? Something inside the story starts to shift. Because suddenly the boundary you set today is no longer just about today. It becomes part of a much longer timeline. And that timeline often starts in very ordinary places. Not dramatic events. Not obvious trauma. Just everyday emotional environments that quietly taught you how connection works. Think about how early we begin learning what keeps relationships safe. As children, we don't learn this through words. We learn it through reactions. Through tone. Through mood. Through the emotional atmosphere of the people around us. We learn what brings closeness. We learn what brings distance. We learn what creates warmth. We learn what creates tension. And we learn fast. A child doesn't need to hear the sentence, "You must take care of other people's feelings." The nervous system learns it through experience. Through moments when harmony feels fragile. Through moments when tension fills the room. Through moments when emotional balance suddenly shifts. Children are incredibly sensitive to these shifts. Not because they are fragile, but because connection is survival. For a child, relationships are not optional. They are the entire emotional world. So the nervous system becomes highly attentive to emotional signals. A sigh. A change in tone. A quiet pause. A stressed voice. These signals may seem small to an adult, but to a child they can feel enormous. Because a child doesn't yet know the difference between a temporary mood and a permanent change in connection. They don't know that adults have stressful days. They don't know that frustration can pass. They don't know that distance can be temporary. They only know that the emotional climate has changed. And when the emotional climate changes, the nervous system begins searching for the reason. Did I do something wrong? Was I too loud? Too needy? Too emotional? Too demanding? The child's brain is wired to find patterns. And when a child repeatedly experiences emotional tension around them, they begin forming quiet rules about how to keep relationships stable. These rules are rarely spoken. They are felt. Stay easy. Stay helpful. Stay agreeable. Stay low maintenance. Don't cause problems. Don't create extra stress. These rules don't feel like pressure at first. They feel like adaptation. Like learning how to belong. And in many ways, they are adaptive. Children who learn how to read emotional environments often become deeply empathetic adults. They become attentive, thoughtful, considerate. They become people who care deeply about how others feel. But sometimes, along with empathy, another belief quietly develops. The belief that closeness depends on emotional harmony. That connection stays safe when tension stays low. That relationship stays stable when others feel comfortable. That belonging is linked to emotional smoothness. And once that belief takes root, the nervous system begins working hard to maintain emotional equilibrium. You may not notice this happening as a child. It simply becomes normal. You become the one who tries to keep the peace. The one who senses tension quickly. The one who smooths conversations. The one who adapts. You learn how to anticipate needs. How to adjust tone. How to read the room. You may even become known as the easy one. The reliable one. The thoughtful one. And these qualities are often praised, appreciated, encouraged. So the emotional rule grows stronger. Being good means being easy. Being kind means being flexible. Being loved means being safe to be around. No one explicitly teaches this. It forms quietly, through repetition and emotional experience. And over time, the nervous system starts associating certain behaviors with emotional safety. Agreement feels safe. Helpfulness feels safe. Availability feels safe. But boundaries? Boundaries feel unfamiliar. Because boundaries introduce something new into the emotional environment: tension. Even healthy tension. Even respectful tension. Even temporary tension. The nervous system doesn't always distinguish between harmful tension and normal relational tension. It simply notices the shift. A boundary creates a moment where the emotional atmosphere changes. There is a pause. A difference. A new limit. And if the nervous system learned early that harmony equals safety, then any disruption in harmony can feel risky. Even when nothing dangerous is happening. This is why the guilt after setting boundaries can feel so immediate and so physical. It isn't just a thought. It's a body memory. A signal from a part of the nervous system that learned long ago that emotional stability must be protected. The adult mind may understand boundaries logically. But the emotional system responds to the shift in atmosphere first. The response is fast. Automatic. Familiar. A boundary is set. The emotional climate changes slightly. The nervous system reacts. Not because the boundary is wrong. Because the change feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar can feel unsafe. This doesn't mean your childhood was chaotic or unstable. Many emotionally responsible adults come from loving homes. But even in loving environments, children can learn that being easy makes life smoother. That being flexible reduces stress. That being agreeable keeps things calm. That being low maintenance keeps relationships warm. These lessons are subtle. They live in everyday moments. A parent relieved when plans don't change. A teacher praising cooperation. A family dynamic that values harmony. Over years, these small experiences accumulate into an emotional blueprint. A blueprint that quietly connects self-worth with emotional comfort for others. So when you set a boundary as an adult, something old is gently activated. Not a memory in words. A memory in sensation. The sensation that harmony has shifted. That emotional balance has changed. That connection might need repair. And because this reaction feels so automatic, it can feel confusing. You might think the guilt means you did something wrong. But what if the guilt is simply the nervous system noticing that you did something new? Something unfamiliar. Something outside the old emotional rule. The rule that said connection must always feel smooth. And once you begin to see this pattern, a new kind of curiosity can emerge. If this reaction is learned, can it also be unlearned? If the nervous system adapted once, can it adapt again? Because the moment you begin asking that question, the story starts opening in a new direction. One where boundaries don't automatically feel like danger. One where emotional tension doesn't automatically mean disconnection. One where saying no doesn't automatically feel like doing something wrong. And that possibility begins to shift the meaning of the guilt itself. When you begin to see that the guilt is a learned response, something subtle but powerful starts to change. The feeling doesn't disappear overnight. You still notice the tightness in your chest. You still feel the urge to over-explain. You still replay conversations in your head. But now, alongside the guilt, a new thought appears: this reaction has a history. That thought alone can soften the experience. Because instead of interpreting guilt as proof that you did something wrong, you begin to see it as a signal from a nervous system that is adjusting to a new way of relating. And this is where we can gently bring in the psychology behind what's happening. Your nervous system is not designed to maximize logic. It is designed to maximize safety. Safety, in this context, doesn't always mean physical danger. It often means relational safety, the feeling that connection is stable, predictable, and secure. For years, your brain built shortcuts to maintain that stability. These shortcuts are called emotional associations. Over time, your brain learned, harmony equals safe. Discomfort equals risky. Approval equals connection. Disapproval equals distance. These associations are fast and automatic. They operate beneath conscious thought. By the time your logical mind starts analyzing the situation, your emotional system has already reacted. This is why guilt appears so quickly after setting a boundary. It's not the result of deep reflection. It's the result of emotional conditioning. Your nervous system detects a shift in relational dynamics and sends a familiar signal: check the connection. Repair the connection. Protect the connection. It does this even when the relationship is healthy. Even when the other person respects your boundary. Even when nothing has actually changed. Because the nervous system is responding to pattern, not present reality. And patterns take time to update. One of the most important ideas here is this: emotional habits don't disappear just because we understand them. You can know that boundaries are healthy. You can know that saying no is normal. You can know that you're allowed to protect your time and energy. And still feel guilty. This doesn't mean the understanding failed. It means the nervous system is still learning. Think of it like learning a new language. At first, every sentence feels slow and awkward. You pause. You search for words. You worry about mistakes. Over time, the language becomes natural. But the early stage always feels uncomfortable. Boundaries work the same way. When you begin setting them more intentionally, your nervous system enters a learning phase. The old emotional shortcuts no longer fit perfectly, but the new ones are not fully established yet. This in-between stage can feel especially uncomfortable. You may notice a strange mix of emotions, relief and guilt at the same time. Pride and doubt at the same time, confidence and anxiety in the same moment. This emotional contradiction can feel confusing, but it is actually a sign of growth. It means your emotional system is updating. For years, saying yes felt like the safest path. It maintained harmony and prevented tension. It kept relationships predictable. Now, saying no introduces a new experience. A new possibility. The possibility that relationships can remain stable even when you set limits. At first, your nervous system doesn't fully trust this possibility. It needs repeated evidence. Each time you set a boundary and the relationship survives, your brain gathers new data. Each time someone respects your no, your emotional system learns something new. Each time the world doesn't collapse after you prioritize yourself, the old rule loosens slightly. This process is slow and subtle. It doesn't feel dramatic. But it is deeply transformative. You may start noticing small shifts. The guilt still appears, but it fades faster. The overthinking still starts, but it ends sooner. The urge to apologize still arises, but it feels less urgent. These small changes are signs that the nervous system is recalibrating. It is learning that connection is more resilient than it once believed. This learning process also involves a shift in how we understand responsibility. Many people grow up with a blurred line between responsibility and emotional responsibility. Responsibility means being accountable for your actions, your words, and your behavior. Emotional responsibility, as it is often experienced, goes further. It includes feeling responsible for how others feel in response to your actions. This expanded sense of responsibility can feel compassionate, but it can also become overwhelming. Because emotions are complex and influenced by many factors. No single person controls another person's emotional experience. When you set a boundary, you are responsible for how you communicate it. You are responsible for being respectful, clear, and kind. But you are not responsible for preventing every uncomfortable feeling that might follow. This distinction can feel radical at first. It can feel unfamiliar to separate your intention from someone else's reaction. Your brain may resist the idea, because the old rule said, keep everyone comfortable. But relationships are not built on the absence of discomfort. They are built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. And sometimes, honesty includes limits. Healthy relationships have space for small moments of tension. Space for differences. Space for boundaries. These moments do not break connection. They deepen it. Because real closeness is not built on constant agreement. It is built on authenticity. When you stop overmanaging other people's emotional experiences, you create space for more honest interactions. You allow others to experience their own reactions. You allow conversations to be real. You allow connection to exist without constant emotional cushioning. This shift can feel unfamiliar at first. But over time, it becomes freeing. You begin to notice that relationships can hold more complexity than you once believed. They can hold agreement and disagreement. Comfort and discomfort. Closeness and independence. And they can remain stable through all of it. This realization slowly changes how boundaries feel. Instead of feeling like threats to connection, they begin to feel like expressions of self-respect. Instead of feeling like disruptions, they begin to feel like clarity. Instead of feeling like harm, they begin to feel like honesty. And as this shift continues, the guilt begins to lose its authority. It becomes a signal of old learning rather than a warning of wrongdoing. A familiar echo, not a present danger. And the more you understand this, the more the emotional experience begins to soften. Because the nervous system is finally learning a new rule: connection can survive boundaries. And once that rule begins to take root, a new emotional possibility opens. One where saying no no longer feels like becoming the bad person, but like becoming a more honest version of yourself. At some point, something subtle begins to shift inside you. Not because the guilt disappears completely, but because you start recognizing it differently. Instead of seeing it as a warning sign, you begin to see it as a familiar echo. A reflex that once helped you stay connected, but that no longer needs to guide every decision. You notice that the feeling still appears, but it no longer carries the same authority. It shows up like an old habit, not a command. You might still feel the urge to explain yourself more than necessary. You might still replay conversations for a while. You might still feel a small wave of discomfort after saying no. But now, alongside those feelings, there is space. Space to pause. Space to breathe. Space to not immediately fix anything. And in that space, something new begins to grow. Trust. Trust that relationships are more stable than your nervous system once believed. Trust that connection does not disappear the moment you protect your time or energy. Trust that being honest does not make you unkind. This trust doesn't arrive dramatically. It builds slowly through repeated experience. Every time you set a boundary and the relationship continues, the old emotional rule weakens a little. Every time someone respects your limit, your nervous system gathers new evidence. Every time the feared distance doesn't appear, your body learns that the emotional landscape has changed. And over time, you begin to notice something unexpected. Boundaries stop feeling like walls. They start feeling like clarity. Instead of creating distance, they create definition. Instead of threatening connection, they make it more honest. You begin to see that when you stop saying yes out of fear, the yes you offer becomes more genuine. Your time becomes more intentional. Your presence becomes more real. Your energy becomes more available when you truly choose to give it. And relationships often respond to that authenticity in surprising ways. People learn your limits. They learn your rhythms. They learn what you can offer and what you can't. And instead of pushing them away, this often makes connection more stable. Because clarity reduces silent expectations. It reduces hidden resentment. It reduces the quiet exhaustion that builds when you constantly override your own needs. When you stop carrying emotional responsibility for everyone else, you free up emotional space for real connection. You begin to show up because you want to, not because you feel obligated. And that difference is felt. It may not be obvious in every moment, but over time it changes the texture of relationships. They become less about constant maintenance and more about mutual presence. Less about managing reactions and more about sharing reality. Less about preventing discomfort and more about allowing honesty. At first, this new rhythm can feel unfamiliar. You may still feel moments of hesitation. Moments where the old guilt whispers that you should soften your boundaries or make yourself more available. But now you recognize the voice. You know where it comes from. You know why it appears. And that knowledge changes how you respond. Instead of immediately obeying the guilt, you can acknowledge it. You can let it exist without letting it decide. And this is where real change happens, not in the absence of guilt, but in your relationship with it. You stop treating it as proof that something is wrong. You start treating it as a sign that something is new. A sign that you are moving outside old patterns. A sign that you are practicing a different way of relating. And over time, the emotional experience of boundaries begins to transform. The anxiety softens. The overthinking shortens. The emotional recovery becomes faster. Until one day, you notice a moment that feels quietly significant. You say no. And the world doesn't shift. You don't replay the conversation for hours. You don't feel the urge to apologize. You don't feel like the bad person. You simply continue your day. That moment may seem small, but it represents a profound change. It means your nervous system has learned something new. It means the old rule has loosened its grip. It means the emotional association between boundaries and danger has begun to fade. And in its place, a new association has started to grow. Boundaries can coexist with connection. Honesty can coexist with kindness. Self-respect can coexist with care. This new understanding doesn't make relationships less meaningful. It makes them more sustainable. Because connection built on constant self-sacrifice eventually becomes fragile. But connection built on mutual respect becomes resilient. The more you allow yourself to experience this new rhythm, the more natural it becomes. You begin to trust that the people who truly value you do not need you to abandon yourself to stay close. You begin to trust that relationships can hold space for both closeness and individuality. You begin to trust that being a good person does not require being endlessly available, and perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust your own limits. Not as barriers, but as signals. Not as rejection, but as guidance. Not as harm, but as honesty. Because boundaries were never meant to push people away. They were meant to show where you end and where someone else begins. And when that line becomes clearer, connection doesn't disappear. It becomes real enough to breathe.